Go on then. Let's get naked. Well, at the very least, let's talk about nudity. You see, the other day, my delightful community and I were over on Twitch and we were talking about the Free the Nipple campaign. The idea that everyone's nipples should be equal. They should be free. If a man is allowed to walk brazenly down the street with top asunder, flashing one's manly breasticles, then all people of all genders should be able to do the same. And that's where the conversation really started. All about the allure of nipples, the taboo of nipples, the practical purpose of nipples literally being there to feed infants. And of course, then we talked about the sexualization of body parts. I'll give you the quick TLDR of what I think. I'm not going to go deep into it right now because we have much to talk about. The TLDR of my opinion is all genders should be equal. There's my nipple. If you want to ban nipples, then ban all nipples. If you want to let people have their nipples on show, then allow everyone to have their nipples on show. With the exception of breastfeeding, because a hungry infant child who needs food should trump all social norms. If you are one of these people who has an aversion to people breastfeeding, just remember that you are one of the people who is literally taking the food out of starving children. That is literally what you do when you turn around and go, "Excuse me, can you cover up? Can you not do that in front of me?" No. Baby takes priority over you and your arrogance, you little... Anyway, enough of my ranting. So naturally, off the back of that, my mind got curious. And for those people that have been around for a while, you know that when my mind gets curious, I need to find out things. So today, we're going to be talking about the most unnatural thing that human beings do, which is cover up their bodies. When people talk about the LGBTQIA being unnatural, and then they are walking around wearing clothing. I mean, really, you know? So yeah, effectively, we're going to talk about the history of nudity, friends. We're going to talk about literally where we came from at a point where human beings literally wandered around completely in the starkers, versus where we are today, where we are needing to cover up our delightful bodies. Make sure nobody ever sees our sexy forms. Heaven forfend. Now, clothing as a subject, as an item, has a marked history in the socio-evolution of humanity. It literally, to our knowledge, marks the end of the Neolithic period and marks the beginning of civilization as we understand it today. Now, I'm not saying that clothing started civilization, but it's a point in history where human beings were starting to be a bit more conscious about themselves, start thinking less instinctually and more intellectually. In the hunter-gatherer cultures of warmer climates, for example, where all humanity started, nudity, or as near to nudity as possible, was completely and utterly the norm. And you can still see that as it's prevalent today in the indigenous cultures of a variety of different peoples, you know? Now, many of you will assume, as I did, that clothing originally came around when human beings needed to be warmer. They put on more layers in order to keep themselves warm against the cold. However, due to the genetic analysis of clothing lice and their evolution from head lice, we can actually date the usage of clothing back to before human beings left the warmer climates of Africa. So it is understood by current scholars that it was less about keeping warm and more about protecting the body away from sunlight, the heat and dust storms that happened in those warmer climates. Though it has to be said that even though our earliest understanding of clothing was actually to protect against the elements of the world, and especially when they started going into colder climates, protect themselves against the cold, one of the earliest usage of animal skins, for example, was actually found to be in the same fashion as body paint or body modification, which is in adornment. Yes. Fashion. One of the earliest uses of clothing was immediately fashion. Now, scholars have thought and assumed that this was possibly to do with ritual practice, to do with spiritual or faithful practice or celebration and what have you. But at the end of the day, regardless of what the beliefs or personal choices may have been, it still was there to look a certain way. And that is fashion. Practicality is all fine and dandy, but fashion. That being said, then nudity is not actually something that really came into it. Nudity isn't something that they were really concerned with from what we understand about those early beginnings of civilizations of men. Now, before I deep dive into the old civilizations and nudity within those old civilizations of human beings, our glorious species that we happen to be, I do want to say that much of our history as we understand it today was written by historians that aligned their views, especially their views of history, with the standards of the time. You see a lot of recurring themes about views of prudishness and conservatism and why people covered up, and a lot of that may have been skewed by the expectations of the peers within that educational structure. As a result of that, many of them refer to the genders as a binary. They talk about men and women. That isn't to say that other genders did not exist throughout history. In fact, there is a copious amount of evidence throughout all historical studies to say that other genders did exist, and not only existed, but were quite prevalent in the majority of cultures throughout history. But, much like sex toys and sex aids being swept under the rug of fertility symbols, genders outside of the binary were often overlooked by historical scholars because it wasn't something that they had within the society that they were present in. Victorian Britain scholars would not have looked outside of the binary of genders because the concept of genders outside of the binary was completely alien to them, you know? Now, let us look to the earliest of civilizations, or the earliest civilizations that historians have understood to date, which is to say Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, and the Sumerians. Now, within those cultures, clothing as a whole was seen as a status symbol. It was usually just a single piece of cloth that was wrapped around them, tied and or pinned about their body. It was normally a piece of sheepskin, or later on it was like woolen clothing or woolen fabric that was wrapped about them. And as I said, it was a mark of status. It was a mark of your position within that society. The clothing that you wore marked you as above the people that didn't wear clothing, that couldn't afford clothing. Now, according to the iconography of the nude in Mesopotamia by Zainab Bahrani, the idea of concealing one's genitalia by means of conservatism or prudery has actually been painted onto the Mesopotamians by Near East and classical scholars. Bahrani goes on to explain that nudity was not only present in ancient Mesopotamia, but it was prevalent. It was everywhere. Everyone was very much celebrated in their naked forms, you know? Then on to ancient Egypt as the civilization that many of you will be familiar with. Again, clothing was seen as a status symbol. Nudity was seen as a completely natural state of being, and clothing was worn by those who were of a higher social status. Laborers, servants, entertainers, they were all often naked or at the very most partially clothed. And like children didn't wear any clothing right up until the point where they hit puberty, approximately 12 years old to what scholars understand today. And the difference, the way they differentiated like the highborn children to the lowborn children was with jewelry. So children would run around naked, but they would be wearing jewelry to symbolize their status. And then it was only when they hit puberty, that's when it was like, okay, cool, you can now wear clothing. You are now of an age where clothing is appropriate. We are very swiftly whipping through the centuries here and going straight on to ancient Greek, where in ancient Greek, nudity was actually celebrated, but only if you were a man. It was basically the opposite of what the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians viewed clothing as. Clothing in ancient Greece was seen as a way to cover up your shame, whereas Greek men were promoted and told to display their nudity as it was a show of beauty and power as seen by their gods. And as a result, the ancient Greeks celebrated nudity, very specifically male nudity, more than any other culture throughout the entirety of history. Unless, of course, you were a woman. And then you were encouraged to cover up. Unless, of course, it was a religious or celebratory festival, in which case there was the ability for women to go nude if they wished to. However, generally speaking, they were encouraged to cover up. As I mentioned before, part of that whole concept the Greeks had was about clothing covering up shame, clothing covering up shameful bodies. And Aristotle actually stated that women were, and I quote, deformed, incomplete males, designed to be subservient to men. The argument was, in ancient Greek times, that a baby started in the womb as a female and grew to be a male. And if they were born as a female, they were incomplete. They were deformed men. They were lesser than men. And that is the reason why they were seen as subservient, or expected to be subservient to men. Now, it was slightly different for neighboring civilizations like the Spartans, where men and women were seen a lot more on a equal level. Like, women were allowed to train in the same way that men were, and often women went into battle in the same way that men did. But there was still a social structure where women were not perceived as good as men. In fact, there is an understanding that the standard sexual practice in ancient Greek times was that a male Greek individual, a Greek man, would have sex for pleasure with other men. And they would have sex for procreation with women. So homoeroticism was absolutely rife, and they had sex with other men for pleasure. And the only time that they looked at women in a sexual capacity, according to some scholars, was when they wanted to procreate, when they wanted to have children, etc. Off the back of that, the first public condemnation of nudity in regards to like entire civilizations' condemnation of nudity was actually the Roman Empire. Now, many of you may assume that the reason for this is potentially because of efficiency, making sure that everything was practical and sorted and done in the most efficient way possible, because the Romans were well known for being efficient. But no, the main reason, according to scholars, one of the primary reasons for the condemnation of the naked form was homophobia. Yes, the fear of homoeroticism, the fear of femininity within men condemned the view of being naked. And given how homoeroticism was rife in Greece, we can understand where the comparison came from and potentially the condemnation came from. Oh, well, we've stolen their gods, but we don't want to be like them Greeks. Oh, they're constantly at it. Oh, Jesus. You know? Only they wouldn't say Jesus because Jesus wasn't born yet. But anyway, the poet Ennius declared, exposing naked bodies among citizens is the beginning of public disgrace. Really hammering in that idea that nudity was bad. However, it wasn't to do with sex that nudity became bad. Despite all the homoeroticism thing, it was seen as undignified. It was undignified of a man to be effeminate. It was undignified of a man to be homosexual. And therefore, the covering of the body wasn't to do with sex. It was more to do with dignity. Going back to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian views of things, it was a social standing as well. As a quick way of differentiating yourself from the conquered, from those who had been enslaved, the Romans wore clothing. The people they conquered didn't. And often, people that they did conquer and subsequently enslave were stripped of any clothing they wore, because they then didn't become people, they became property. Naturally, people associate the Romans not only with the soldier garb, but with the toga. The educated view. In fact, many people, especially in modern interpretations of ancient Greek ways, put the toga on the Greeks as well, but as discussed, they were more naked than anything else. And the toga was like the greatest depiction of not nudity, because it completely covered one's form. There was no way to know what a person's body looked like because it was wrapped around in so many layers of different cloth. And there was a glorification of the toga in Roman society because it also depicted the republic of the people. The idea that they were one people that were run by themselves, not by any governing element, especially in the later parts of the Roman Empire. However, despite this condemnation of Roman nudity, the Greek art was seen to directly influence Roman art and sculptures. Many of the Roman heroes and the gods were depicted as nude. The works of art were actually commissioned to follow in the manner of the Hellenistic kings, which is to say, nude, regal, and royal. And that was shocking to the Roman people, not even necessarily because of the nudity, but because of the royal element of it. The idea that this naked figure could be the anti-republic. It was royal. It was a monarchy. It was the idea of power to a single person as opposed to a democratic system. One of the arguments that actually goes in line with the idea that it was not to do with sex and more to do with dignity was the fact that depictions of sexual items were pretty rife throughout ancient Rome. Both sex and very specifically the penis were quite well displayed, especially in like tales and depictions of ancient Roman mythology. A lot of temples had sexual cults within them, or sexual practices where the priests and priestesses would perform sexual favors in honor of insert god here. And then, of course, Christianity got its claws into the Roman Empire. And as the Roman Empire died off, Christianity spread itself around. Now, before I go any further, I understand that we've talked about like the ancient times and what have you, and that's great and wonderful. And that covers ancient civilization across the world as we know it today. However, from this point onwards, it kind of diversifies in regards to the history of the land, and I am going to focus primarily on Europe because that's where I live, and the world is very, very big, and I don't have the time to go through all of the different depictions throughout the entirety of human history and civilization in regards to their relationships with nudity. So we're going to focus ourselves, we're going to go from this big old world, and we're going to focus ourselves down to specifically European history from the collapse of the Roman Empire and nakedness therein. Now, this era is known as the post-classical era. A lot of the ancient Rome, ancient Greece is like the classical era. This is the post-classical era, as historians know it today. So let's talk about some post-classical nudity, shall we? Now, skipping forward a few centuries, we can see that nudity was pretty much reserved for like swimming, bathing, and religious ceremony across Europe. Especially in regards to the pagans, a lot of their religious practices revolved around being nude for the ceremony that they partook in. One such ceremony was in order to guarantee a fertile crop and a fertile field for harvest. A young maiden would be naked and go into the field, and she wasn't allowed to be touched by anyone for fear of corrupting that purity and that fertility, and therefore not being able to pass it on to the field. For example, as a sort of Christian reflection of this in its own special way, Christians of this time were expected to get baptized naked. The idea being that that was how they were created in the image of God, and as they have their sins forgiven through the medium of baptism, where they were completely submerged in the water and came out anew, they came out as God had formed them, as God had created them on this earth. Now, following this sort of era, towards the middle of the post-classical era, is when we really start to see elements of fashion. And fashion is what killed off nudity throughout the land. Here was me thinking it was all down to Christian condemnation, but no, it turns out that fashion and classism was actually what killed off nudity within humans. Well, human civilization at least. This was where you really started seeing like a lower class, a middle class, and a higher class, and the more fashionable clothing that you wore, the more important you were in your society. Thus, the less clothing you wore, the less important you were in society. Once again, going back to the ancient Mesopotamian style views of clothing. Clothing was a class thing. The more important, the more fashionable. The less important, the less clothing. And this is where we first really get an idea of a direct association between lack of clothing and active embarrassment. The idea that you couldn't afford clothing being an embarrassing factor where people looked down on you for not having what they had. I'm sure classism was probably rife throughout the entirety of history, but this is the first time that we see an actual depiction, or the first time I have read of an actual depiction associating nudity with embarrassment. Now, it wasn't really until the 8th century where sexualization came into the concepts of nudity. It was in the 8th century that Christianity started to sexualize parts of the body, and specifically sexualize those elements that they could condemn people for, and specifically condemn the sexualization of those parts of the body, despite the fact that it was them that were sexualizing them in the first place. Yay! Corruption! It was in the 8th century that Christians stopped being baptized completely naked. And the argument that I have read is that it was too direct an association to the religious practices of the pagan people who would have a lot of nudity, and parallel to that, some sexual practices within their religious ceremonies. To step further away from the pagans, despite having stolen a few of their holidays, Christians decided to condemn nudity and condemn the sexualization of the human form. The following centuries from that saw an active persecution from Christians about sex and sexuality. In fact, Albert Magnus condemned sex outside of wedlock. He was the first person documented to have condemned sex outside of the marital unit. And then Thomas Aquinas condemned lustful thoughts altogether. Thomas Aquinas was the one that stated that sex should purely be for procreation, and anything lustful, any idea of copulation outside of procreation was sinful and wrong. And from what I've read, that taboo actually lasted from that age right up until like the Renaissance period. So you're talking like the 8th century through to the 16th century. A long old time. Despite all of this, and circling all the way back to the original point of this conversation, where it all began, the nipple. It turns out that breasts and female nipples were not actually seen as sexual right up until the 16th and 17th century with the witch trials. Prior to that time, prior to the 16th and 17th century, artwork displayed women with breasts out, and it was seen at the time as a sort of motherly love and caring, and a sign of nurturing when a woman had her breasts out. And then in the witch trials of the 16th and 17th century, that's when we really saw the condemnation of boobs as a whole. God, they really hated women, didn't they? Now, that's the brief summary of nudity in the post-classical era, and naturally we move on to the early modern era. For those people that don't know, I'm not a historian. I just got really carried away with all of this, so a lot of these eras don't fully make sense to me, and yet here I am learning all about them because I needed to know how nudity was treated throughout the entirety of the human species. Okay, the Renaissance. Yeah, the Renaissance. The hippies of ye olde times. The Renaissance is well known for its artistic and philosophical movements. It really saw a rise in the idea of rich people being patrons of artistic, creative people, and within that realm was also thinkers, philosophers, that kind of thing. And as a result of that, a lot of the old art and poetry and writings of the ancient Greek were resurfacing and reevaluated. And this is the first time that we really see a step away from the condemnation of nudity and a separation of nudity from sex. The period of the Renaissance saw nudity as pure and innocent, a form that humans took before the fall of man. For those people that don't know what the fall of man is, we're talking ye olde Garden of Eden, snake tempted Eve to bite the fruit of forbidden knowledge or what have you. That is the fall of man. And the Renaissance philosophers and artists saw nudity as the before that point, the point where Adam and Eve didn't realize they were naked, before they knew what clothing was and they felt the need to cover themselves. And as a result, we really saw a resurgence in the Renaissance artwork of nudity and nakedness in a non-sexual fashion. However, that dream was short-lived, because shortly after that, in fact, still within the Renaissance period, technically, we saw a real push on colonialization of the world, where a lot of countries, very specifically my own, Britain, decided the rest of the world needed a little bit of civilization, and explorers were sent out to discover what they can find in the name of their king/queen. These explorers reported back to their monarchs that there were a whole load of indigenous native people who had nudity as part of their natural society. Reports of Native Americans being naked, the reports of the African people being naked. And due to our massive arrogance, the idea of nudity started to be associated with the idea of savagery. Only a savage person who was uncivilized would go around without clothing. Little aside here, friends, it really angers me when I learn about like the history of my nation and how much we wronged other people, but let's crack on. Reports show that the people who were captured and kidnapped in Africa were sold naked. Whether they had clothing or not doesn't really matter. They were sold naked. And then the civilized people of Europe and the Americas would baptize their slaves and clothe them. Next came the Age of Enlightenment. And when we say enlightenment, we're talking about scientific enlightenment. And of course, the Victorian era. It was this period that we really saw the biggest restriction of nudity throughout the history of Europe, at the very, very least. This was the time when nudity was really condemned for all people of all genders. The classic idea of flashing an ankle being a little bit risque was true. Beaches and bathhouses were segregated by gender. People were expected to cover up completely when they went swimming. In fact, there were laws in place to make sure that women in Britain were not allowed within a certain distance of any boy over the age of 12 who was swimming, for fear that woman may arouse something in the boy. I'm not entirely sure. But this is the time where we really see the invention of public changing spaces, where someone can go and privately get changed out of one outfit into another outfit so that no one dare see their naked form. And this was probably, despite the condemnation of sexuality and eroticism by the church throughout the entirety of the post-classical era, this was probably the one time in Europe, and very specifically in Britain, where we saw a real crackdown on the concept of human beings in society of all genders, of all classes, being naked. However, I did read a little thing about the fact that the coal mines were so unbelievably hot that the vast majority of coal miners would wander around naked. They would do their job naked so they didn't get snagged in the tight tunnels. And also, because everyone was so hot and sweaty, promiscuity was rife down in the coal mines. Finally, we are into the contemporary realms, which is modern day society, from like the 1900s onwards, really. Now, in the pre-war 1900s, there was a huge surge of nudists. It was led by Germany and then spread out throughout Europe, where basically people were told by health professionals, there was a big medical board that gathered and stated that more exposure to sun and fresh air was better for your health, and encouraged the concept of nudity and nudist designated areas. And as a result, in the early 1900s through to like the 1920s, we really saw a lot of designated areas within the different countries that were specifically designed for people to go and be naked, go and gather the vitamin D, go and get the fresh air on their naked skin. This actually birthed the movement of naturism. The idea of a naturist being naked and one with nature formed in approximately the 1920s. But this was also a rehashing of the idea of a distinct difference between nudity for health purposes and spiritual purposes, and nudity for sex. That idea of nudity and being one with nature, being one in your natural form and one with nature, really resurged with the 1960s, where we saw the hippies and the countercultural movements of various different counterculture sects who really embraced nature in all of its forms. And between the 60s and now, we have seen a variety of pushing and pulling of people pushing for more liberal concepts of embracing each other, being one with oneself, understanding yourself, being okay with yourself, and more conservative views of condemning nudity, of respect and dignity being the first and foremost, but understanding your place in society as opposed to your place as an individual. However, when you look at the grand scope of recent history, like the past 50, 60 years, there is a movement that is slowly but surely, and I do mean very slowly, but surely, moving towards becoming more accepting of sex, of sexuality, and of bodies, of nudity as a whole. It's becoming less of a taboo and more of something that is accepted, whatever walk of life you happen to come from. And that brings us up to date, really. Should we do a little summary? Let's do a little summary of everything we have learned today, shall we? The TLDR of the entire video. To the surprise of absolutely no one, especially if you're a member of my community, like realistically speaking, you shouldn't be surprised by this. Women have had the rough end of the stick in every society, in every culture, throughout the entirety of history of all of the cultures that we have explored today. Don't know about other cultures, and you know what? If you want me to do videos on other cultures and other areas of the world and their views on nudity, let me know. I'm sure I can pull something together. I'm sure I can look into it. I found this entirely fascinating, so hell, I'll do more of it by all means. As civilization progressed, class created fashion, and fashion inevitably condemned nudity. We found that nudity in some cultures was celebrated, but only specific criteria of aesthetically pleasing nudity, and clothes were used to cover up shameful bodies. Guess what, friends? Your bodies aren't shameful, regardless of what your body looks like. It's your body. You should embrace it and love it. It's great. Though the encouragement to cover up was very much prevalent for other genders, the condemnation of male nudity was brought around because of homophobia. Then after the fall of the Roman Empire, we saw religion, good old Christianity, take over, and slowly but surely over the course of many centuries, we saw more and more of the body being sexualized and thus condemned. There is an argument here to say that people who were forcing themselves to suppress their sexual urges because they were celibate or they had sworn celibacy were getting aroused by the smallest of things because they knew that they weren't allowed to have it, and subsequently condemned people for their own lustful desires. Breasts had always been seen as a point of motherly love, a point of attraction potentially, but very specifically to do with nurturing and caring for an infant child, until the witch trials, where again, religion, and very specifically King James, who is well known for having the most popular Bible in the world, condemned all womankind for being witches. I did a deep dive on the witches. If you want to check it out, it's on my other channel on VODs and Vanity. I'll put a link to it down below. All right. Now, a little bit of trivia off the back of the condemnation of women's nipples. It turns out that male nipples were actually illegal in the United States up until 1936. I am all for the equality of the genders. If you're going to ban one set of nipples, you should ban them all. And I was fascinated to find out that it was illegal for men to show their nipples. And of course, modern times have seen a more liberal view, a more understanding view, and a more accepting view of sex, of sexual practice, of society's relationship to nudity as a whole. And the hang-ups that today's society is facing around nudity are, at the very best, a century old. And at the very worst, several centuries old. So yeah, that's nudity. That's the big brief history of nudity throughout human history, focusing on Europe. At the end of the day, we're all born naked. It is our natural form, and it is not automatically sexual. It's not sexual when you're washing yourself in the morning. It's not sexual when you go to the doctors to get checked up. It's not sexual when you're getting changed in a changing room. The human body is made sexual by the societal views of the time. And as we have seen in this very brief history, society's views have changed multiple times throughout history, mainly dictated by those people in charge, primarily men, but not always men. But society is changing, especially with the invention of social media. And I feel like now is a very different time, because as much as the laws and the legality of things is dictated by people in power, by elected officials, social media has put us in a position where the voice of the individual, good or bad, for condemnation or liberation, the voice of the individual is much easier to be heard. So with that in mind, who knows how society will change in the future? Who knows what will be accepted and not accepted in the years, decades, potentially even centuries to come? Friends, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. I got really stuck into this one. Really stuck into this one. I every so often sink my teeth into a subject and it really gets me going, and this was the one for me. And it all stemmed because we randomly started talking about the Free the Nipple campaign on stream. Speaking of stream, if you want to check me out, go check me out on twitch.tv/ValenVain. We talk about all kinds of things. Monday nights we do our just chatting and stuff like that, where we talk about all bits and pieces. You can also check me out on TikTok, where I do far more short form content, where I talk about whimsical facts about sex and show you a little bit more of what's going on in my life at the moment. Or you can check me out on Instagram, where you see my delightful visage. You see a lot of behind the scenes stuff and get to see a lot more of the random stuff that I get up to, you know? If you want more stuff like this, if you like the deep dives, if you like some of the more whimsical deep dives where I just go off on one and find my inspiration to learn something about the history of human beings, then please let me know. If you've got any specific things you would love to see me explore, stick them down in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Oh, and of course, while I remember, don't forget to press the like button and press the subscribe button if you haven't done it already. And if you're not sure about subscribing, check out some of my other videos and then decide whether you want to subscribe. But yeah, thank you very much, friends, for sticking with me through this really random and yet extremely fascinating journey on a very brief history of nudity. Over the next few days, I'm going to be going to see Alien Romulus, so I will let you know how that is. Many of you will be part of this community because of my reaction to the Alien Romulus trailers. And as a result, I thought, hey, let me go see the movie and report back to you without giving any spoilers. So next week's video is going to be all about that. Okay? Give you a little bit of a heads up of what's coming. Okay? Until next time, you beautiful beings, don't do anything I wouldn't do. Because if I wouldn't do it, we'll fucking kill you.